Richard Munson provides an incisive and rich account of Benjamin Franklin's life and career, recovering this vital part of Franklin's story, revealing his modern relevance, and offering a compelling portrait of a shrewd experimenter, a clever innovator, and a visionary physicist whose fame opened doors to negotiate French support and funding for American independence. Munson's riveting narrative explores how science underpins Franklin's entire story, from serving as a tradesman to an inventor to one of the founders of our nation, and argues that Franklin's political life cannot be understood without giving proper credit to his scientific experiments. Now, I want to tell you a little personal story. I met Dick Munson when he was the graduate advisor to the dorm where I was living when I was in college quite a while ago. So I have known him through many parts of his career. He is a prolific author, having written several books on a wide variety of topics, from Tech to Table, 25 Innovators Who Are Reimagining Food, profiling how entrepreneurs change how we farm and what we eat, looking at solutions to the biggest problems created by our industrialized food. His previous book, Tesla, the Inventor of the Modern, not about the car, but I wonder if that's where the car's name came from, reveals the man who transformed our world with electric motors, radio, robots, and remote control. And that biography has been translated into about a dozen languages. He also wrote a book called Cardinals of Capitol Hill, which traces the machinations of congressional appropriators, something that is a continuing query as we try to understand what's going on with the funding of our government. He's worked on clean energy, environmental issues for nonprofits, in the private sector, at universities, and on Capitol Hill. Most recently, he was the senior director of the Environmental Defense Fund, where he advanced smart power in the Midwest. He's been a senior vice president at the Recycled Energy Development, a Chicago-based startup firm that sought to cut greenhouse gas emissions by capturing waste energy. In Washington, D.C., he coordinated the Northeast Midwest Institute and the Congressional and Senate coalitions, bipartisan caucuses that conducted policy research and drafted legislation on brownfield redevelopment, energy, environmental, water quality, and manufacturing issues. He's been a coordinator of Sunday, Solar Lobby, Environmental Action Foundation, and the University of Michigan's pilot program. He has received numerous awards for his public service, from Smart Grid Today, from the Great Lakes Commission, the U.S. Clean Power, and on and on. So I want to now give you the opportunity to hear from Dick Munson himself as he talks about Benjamin Franklin and his new book. Dick.
Jane Campbell, I appreciate your kind introduction and invitation as well. I do feel dated, however, by the numerous activities, and it has been a pleasure having numerous interactions with you over the years. So appreciate the invitation. We will talk about Ben Franklin. Actually, it's appropriate to be talking about Ben Franklin to the Capitol Historical Society, because I think his image in either sculptures or paintings are at least 6, if not more, scattered throughout the United States Capitol building. So in this era when we are talking about our founders and the role of the Constitution as we face, today's challenges, Ben Franklin stands out as one we need to, I think, reconsider where he's from, because he is famous. I mean, his image adorns the $100 bill. His portrait is probably one of the more bipartisan things that still exists, because it still remains hung on the wall of the Oval Office of the White House. His witticisms, things like early to bed, early to rise, these remain pervading our culture And his memoir was probably the all-time favorite autobiography. He actually had this wonderful quote where he suggested, if you would not be forgotten as soon as you are dead and rotten, either write things worth reading or do things worth writing. And he, Benjamin Franklin, obviously did both extremely well. But I want to suggest that we really don't know him as well as we believe, nor as richly as he deserves. And particularly in these hyper-partisan days, I suggest that we need a fresh look at Franklin, in part to understand his modern relevance, but also to, I guess, view him as more than what has become his comic caricature, or as simply an envoy and a wordsmith. Part of the problem, I think, is the rather unfortunate caricatures. In the past few years, his image has been used to sell, I don't know, mutual funds, cereal, cookies, the list goes on. His kite experiment even has been mocked. There's been Broadway plays that have presented him as little more than a womanizer who loved to have French women sit in his lap. One journalist actually referred to Benjamin Franklin as our founding flirt. And perhaps the best known paintings that we have of Franklin portray him either as some crazy codger out in the middle of a field with a kite, it's virtually begging to be electrocuted, or as an eccentric, receiving Prometheus-like fire from the sky. So another reason to look at him afresh, I think, is that most biographers have, in my opinion, focused only on certain characteristics, particularly his diplomacy, and they've ignored other characteristics that, particularly his science. As an example, last year there was this 8-part television series, nicely done, where Michael Douglas portrayed Franklin negotiating an alliance with France. Most biographers actually write off Franklin's experiments as either a sideline or a hobby, and they tend to devote maybe a page or two, sometimes a chapter, to his science. The Pulitzer Prize-winning novel or biography of Franklin devoted only about 25 of its almost 800 pages to Franklin's science work. And Encyclopedia maintains that Franklin never thought science was as important as his public service. I disagree. And I say this with all due respect to his role as one of our nation's founders. He was, in fact, the only person to sign all 4 of the key documents creating the United States. And his accomplishments diplomatically in France were remarkable. I mean, he convinced a Catholic king to provide money and armaments to Protestant rebels who were trying to overthrow another monarch. His ability to negotiate that was just quite remarkable. And I want to suggest that we wouldn't be discussing his diplomatic prowess were it not for his fame as a leading scientist, which opened the door for him to meet with politicians, kings, intellectual leaders, reporters, publishers, and others in France, Britain, and the colonies. Science was not, in my view, a sideline. It was actually the through line that integrated all of Franklin's attributes. Reason, experimentation, observation, these pervaded his life. They're the core to his success as a publisher, as a patriot, as a politician. He joked that he preferred talking to he referred to them as philosophical friends, rather than talking politics with all the grandees of the earth. And I think we have to recognize that as Jane noted, his science went well beyond the sort of much hyped but much misunderstood kite experiment to include leading edge research, as Jane said, on electricity, heat, refrigeration, the ocean currents, weather patterns, communication among ants. The list sort of goes on as to what this polymath touched on. But it also, he is sometimes viewed as a tinkerer, if you will, in part because the kite was in fact, a child's toy. But he did leading edge research in these areas and came up with some fundamental laws about the conservation of charge, about the interactions of oil and water. And his commitment to reason underlies not only his views towards natural forces, but he extended his science towards thinking about demographics, politics, and even served as the basis for colonial cooperation. It's important to realize that Franklin was no anonymous scientist working in some dark basement, laboratory. He became a celebrity, and he was actually something of a rock star, because he conducted understandable experiments. I mean, who could not appreciate flying a kite? But he also was this master networker who hooked up particularly with other writers, who would then extend the reach of his ideas. He also, as an early newspaper man, knew how to write clearly, cogently, and engagingly. So he became famous, feted by kings and politicians, but he also, through his various writings, particularly about ways to wealth, he endeared himself to the rising middle class. Particularly while in France, crowds would follow him saying, "Viva Franklin," as his carriage, ran down the streets of Paris. His image appeared on everything from medallions to snuff boxes to even French women wearing wigs that looked or were based on Franklin's Merton fur cap that he purchased on his way to Canada on one trip. So to give you an idea of his science, also let me suggest that he became famous, I think, also in part because he had this sort of trickster sense of fun associated with how he did it. He put an electric charge on his metal fence surrounding his Philadelphia home, in part because the crowds who would come by, got this thrill of firsthand sort of realizing what an electric charge was. So to give you a sense of his activity, on virtually every occasion of his life, he found some reason to turn to science. One of example is as a young man, he decided that his love of swimming should turn to creating one of his first inventions, which were flippers, which, interestingly enough, about 50 years later, got him inaugurated into the International Swimming Hall of Fame, of all things. But he thought that his swimming speed was limited only by the size of his hands and his feet. So he created flippers, 10-inch long flippers and oval pallets that he, put on his hands and swam. And it did indeed increase his speed, but also it wore him out. But as you can look at other examples, one of my favorite of just how every opportunity turned into a chance for him to reveal his scientific approach. He was out one day with friends on an estate in Maryland, riding horses, and off in the distance was the beginning of a whirlwind that was beginning to pick up debris and move throughout the various fields. His notes for the day suggested that the rest of the crowd, of the other people on horseback, stood where they were and watched the eddy basically advance across various fields through the forest and out the other side. He, however, said, "My curiosity being stronger, I followed it." And so he got on his horse and challenging the conventional wisdom that if you threw something through one of these eddies, it would break it up. He, on his horse, got as close as he could to the whirlwind. And poor horse, but he used his whip to snap through the whirlwind, but it had actually no effect. So he wrote up, as his usual way, his observations. And then the Royal Society of London, as was their usual way, printed and distributed quite widely his observations. And one of the readers was Captain James Cook, the renowned British explorer, who praised it as the most rational account I have read of waterspouts and whirlwinds. So another example, on one of his trips in a convoy sailing to England, he noticed that on those ships that cooks had just recently dumped their grease, the back of the ship, the waves had been stilled. So the cooks, he felt that oil somehow or another calmed the waves. And what resulted from that was sort of a lifetime of papers about the fundamental nature of membranes and fluid dynamics. So we tend to focus, when we think about Franklin's science, we tend to focus only on electricity. But as Jane mentioned, he focused on a wide variety of other topics. Electricity certainly was not something that Franklin invented. It is simply a natural force. He also wasn't the first to even observe its impact. As far as back as, early Greek philosophers, they were rubbing amber across, cat's fur and creating static electricity. But he was the first to devise repeatable experiments that would prove the connection between lightning and electricity and prove the ability for electricity to find a balance, to move its positive charges and negative charges into a balance and move forward. The kite experiment is kind of the thing that everybody thinks of, but what's interesting is that we know actually really little about it. We don't even know, the date or the place. Sometime in June of 1752 and somewhere just outside of Philadelphia. Franklin was also not the first to suggest a connection between lightning and electricity. But he was the first, as I said, to create a experiment, but he wasn't the first to perform his own experiment. That was actually done at the request of the French king by a very brave French philosopher or scientist, Francois Delabarre, who created, stuck a pointed rod up into the sky above a sentry box where he, coveted so that he'd be protected if in fact lightning struck, too directly. That experiment worked. Other Europeans did the same experiment, and everybody was claiming what a great genius Benjamin Franklin was. But Franklin didn't even know about these successes because it took, sometimes 3 weeks, 6 weeks, or sometimes up to 3 months for ships to sail across the Atlantic. And so during that time, Franklin decided, the problem in Philadelphia, he claimed, was that there were not buildings tall enough upon which to hoist a pointed rod. And so he decided, as you might guess, to put a wire on top of a kite to have it fly up into the clouds. And the images that we have of this day kind of suggest total inaccuracies as to what was going on. The most famous, by Currier and Ives, has a picture of what appears to be, a crotchety old codger out in the middle of a field with his young son, frightened, and lightning off in the background. In reality, his son was 22 years old. They both, hid within a shed to protect themselves from lightning strikes. And then what happened is quite surprising in that it was probably one of the noteworthy tests of all times, and yet Franklin didn't mention it for almost 8 months. And even then said, didn't suggest that he had a role in it, only said it may be agreeable to the curious to be informed that the same experiment as done in Europe has succeeded in Philadelphia. So here's one of the most noteworthy tests, and we don't even know why he didn't reveal it. Was he, simply thinking that he was doing something with a child's toy and would be mocked by elite European intellectuals? Did he simply want to prioritize his more theoretical work on electricity? The honest answer is we just don't know. But the kite, I think, has somewhat led to biographers suggesting that Franklin's science should be discounted because it was sort of a child's toy. But his experiments and most consequential occurred before the kite flying on electricity, whereas I suggested he created one of these fundamental laws that said electrical charges, positive and negative charges, constantly seek balance. This was a a law that he referred to as the conservation of charge, which had the wonderful advantage of predicting quite accurately various scientific experiments. And modern day physicists suggest that that law by itself would have been enough to cement his fame as a scientific pioneer. But he did more. One of he was particularly on the cutting edge when it came to heat and cooling. Let me go back. I forgot one thing that I wanted to mention, because he also gave us practical devices, particularly associated with his lightning experiments. They were originally focused on the theoretical, interactions of electricity and the connection to lightning, but it also developed into a very practical device, a lightning rod, which saved both people and buildings. Before Franklin's lightning rod, it was sort of a habit that the faithful would ring church bell towers to ward off the Almighty's, thunder and lightning. This was not a useful or something that helped the long-term health of bell ringers, hundreds of whom were electrocuted. So this lightning rod not only saved buildings and individuals, but it transformed in the popular mind this, what had been a frightening force that represented to many sort of divine anger. It became a natural phenomenon that humans could control. He had other inventions, of course, the efficient stove. He had a flexible catheter that he devised for his brother who had painful kidney stones. And he, of course, also developed bifocals, which was a gift to himself as his eyesight deteriorated. I could go on, but Jane Campbell, do you want to ask questions now, or allow me to keep talking about Mr. Franklin's various polymath interests?
Well, let's ask questions, and we also, of course, invite our audience to join in, put your questions in the Q&A, and I will pose them to you. One of the questions that I had, just which in reading your book, you talked about the fact that Benjamin Franklin sort of applied what he'd learned from science about, fact-based information to his engagement with political world. And when he was editing the Declaration of Independence, that there was a move from calling it a sacred duty to a sacred truth to a self-evident truth. And what is your opinion about sort of those kind of changes?
Well, I think he was of the opinion that the only way Americans would be appreciated and respected by European elites is if they showed some technological and scientific prowess. So he formed the American Philosophical Society, which was this association of scientists or researchers from throughout what were then the cantankerous 13 colonies who did not really get along well at all. So here was one of the first opportunities for colonial-wide cooperation to allow people to engage in scientific discussions. He also, however, not only looked at nature, but he looked at his scientific approach focused on how do you create a new government, a new nation, and viewed that as a series of experiments that were necessary to do. And the point that you make is a very good one. Obviously, everybody knows that Congress had this small committee. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin were on it to draft Declaration of Independence. And Jefferson, in his eloquent way, listed a series of grievances against King George III, as well as, ideals for a new nation. But on the key line of that Franklin edited, Jefferson had written that these truths, such as, all men are created equal, are sacred and undeniable. Franklin, being the wordsmith that he was as a result of having been a newspaperman, narrowed that down to only one word, and he said instead of being sacred, they were self-evident. That may not seem like a huge change, but at the time, particularly this was an era of the Enlightenment when we were suddenly moving away from dogma to science and skepticism. Here was Benjamin Franklin moving from Jefferson's, if you will, spirituality, religious approach of sacred rites to something that was more focused on science, that people did not need to wait on God to make them apparent, but they themselves would be able to find what those truths were and made them more real and tangible to those truths that we hold, as far as what the Declaration of Independence said.
And so I think it's just so interesting how you bring the science and the political world together. You've done a lot of work on environmental matters over the years, and also how that relates in the political world. Imagine Benjamin Franklin now being part of the conversation that we have going on. Do you think that there's anything in his work that would have potentially guided our conversation about climate change?
That I'm not so sure, but I mean, he does, I think, give us a lot of relevance to some of the major debates that we're having at the moment. I mean, I've been particularly concerned about the rise of skepticism towards science and the dismissal of facts. And here we have one of our most popular founders who's suggesting the necessary approach towards observation, experimentation, and the power of facts that should not be denied. While we have people that are advocating, particular religious beliefs, he was out there suggesting civility and tolerance. So his relevance, I think, today is an important one, but it's also quite intriguing that, neither party can particularly claim Benjamin Franklin as their own. He was indeed, a revolutionary, but it took him a long time to get there. And on his way, he was not really one of the initial revolutionaries. He thought the Boston Tea Party was abhorrent. It was just a massive mob that was destroying private property, which he did not find appropriate. He even, suggested that welfare was something that the state should not be involved in because it would lead to more insolence. But he did think that the state, particularly the federal government, should be significantly more powerful to be able to provide the national defense and intercolonial or interstate commerce. So you can't really say that he's one party or the other, but I think what he does do is bring us back to sort of fundamental values that would be, I think, useful in today's conversations. Such values as thinking about facts, of thinking about tolerance, of civility, of the value of science, reason, observation, and experimentation. I think that's what he gives us at a time where we are so polarized in thinking only of things are red or blue or yes or no. So,
and that's helpful. Now, we got a couple questions. People are trying to figure this Gulf Stream thing out. What were his experiments, and what was he trying to sort of demonstrate in all that?
well, he was not the first one to suggest that there was, something going on in the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, Ponce de Leon even noted that, there was a, sort of a river of water that was restricting him from going down in Florida. But I mean, Franklin, when he crossed the Atlantic Ocean, spent a great deal of time doing observations of temperature differentials at various depths, sometimes as far down as 200 feet. And so he discovered as he was crossing that there were sometimes differentials of 70 degrees between the surface water and the submerged water. And he basically concluded that there was, therefore, this river of warm water that was flowing with some rapidity over the cold base water and moving up the Atlantic coast and then across over to England. And so not only did he think about how this impacted weather patterns, but he also gave advice and drew maps for ship captains so that they, in his words, could catch the current and greatly reduce the amount of time necessary to cross the Atlantic Ocean. So just another of his polymath interests. You sort of throw him on the boat to go across and he thinks, I got to do something, as you suggested, he sort of out of the blue thinks, let's do physics today. Well, in this instance, he was saying, what is this about this, warm river of water? And it just led to a series of experiments and observations about weather patterns, but also practical guidance, in this case, for ship captains to speed up their voyages.
And what about medicine? How did any of his experiments, I understand he had, did a few autopsies with, had a few things that his son-in-law, when he died, left him a bunch of bones in the basement. Now, give me
Yeah, they
this,
found
right?
in the basement of his London-based home, there were lots of bones. And yes, it's his son-in-law who was a doctor. The theory is that those are the results of the cadavers that he was experimenting with. Franklin himself came up with everything from theories about the common cold, suggesting that it was not really the result of chilly air, but it was basically germs. He didn't use that term, but they moved across. And one of the funniest stories is he and John Adams, who never really got along. John Adams, this great Puritan from Boston, thought that Benjamin Franklin, particularly in France, was a womanizing, attention grabber, and didn't like him much. But one evening in the United States, they were traveling together and had to share a bed together, and Franklin wanted to, keep the windows open because he felt that the fresh air would, ensure that they didn't catch a cold. Adams was thinking, you open the window and I'm going to be cold. So you have Franklin going off. And the story is that both of them report was going off in theorizing about the common cold, and Sam Adams was there underneath his blanket shivering, trying to get to sleep. So the one thing that also was somewhat relevant is that, at an early stage, one of the most disappointing parts of his life is that his young son, then only 4 years old, died of smallpox. And Franklin blamed himself because his son had been sick with the flu ahead of time and therefore did not get inoculated. And Franklin became a key proponent of inoculations, thinking that, as the evidence showed, throughout the colonies, the reduction of smallpox deaths and illnesses as a result of inoculation. So he was a real champion of that part of medicine, not only making fun of Sam Adams, but also thinking quite forward thinking about the role of inoculations in public health policy.
Interesting. Now, of course, now you got to know about our audience. These folks are like, they're researching as you're talking what's going on. So just be aware that that's who we have. So one of our folks says, when you talked about Benjamin Franklin signed the four founding documents, that being the Declaration, the Constitution, the alliance with France, and the peace treaty with Great Britain.
Yes.
And she found something that said Roger Sherman was the only person who signed four founding documents, but they're different ones. Do you know?
Well, these were my suggestions of what were the key ones. I'm happy to be corrected and get more light shining on others who were key, signers of various documents. But my point was simply, he was there at the founding. I mean, when the Constitutional Convention was arising, he was, an old man. I think he was about 81 at that time, and compared to Jefferson, who was only 44. So he was of a different generation, but had seen everything. I mean, he'd been there negotiating this, treaty with France, and I, suggested as to how complex that was to convince a Catholic king to do what he had them do. But I think my point was to simply not dismiss others who were key signers, but he was a key player in so many parts of the founding of this country, which I think is why his portrait is in so many places, the U.S. Capitol and in the Oval Office.
Well, and the fascinating thing is that he stayed with it. He stayed with it for so long and continued to be in a leadership role. And that's unusual.
Yeah, even, at 81 years old, he had, painful boils and kidney stones. I mean, he was carried, on a stretcher, if you will, from his house to the State House during the Constitutional Convention. But he was indeed there, because he couldn't stand or even speak too much, he would write out his speeches and somebody else would deliver them. This shows just how frail he was, but he was also, so totally respected. At the end, he gives this, discussion of the Constitution, suggesting that it's not perfect, but it's darn good, as the best, we did the best we can. And, we are doing an experiments in government making. I think that was noting his respect, in part because of his age, because he had seen so much. I think others were suggesting that at some point they had to say, yeah, it wasn't perfect, but it's darn good. And we'll amend it in the future when we have to. But it's a document we can all live with and vote for.
And they did, and we're going to be 250 years as we move forward.
Yep.
So, now, one of the questions, do you know something called Founders Online? Is that a resource that is legitimate? I
don't know about that one. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's one of our folks queried about that.
One thing I would suggest that there is, for Franklin aficionados, Yale University scholars and scholars from the American Philosophical Society have put together an online catalog of virtually and probably every letter that Franklin ever wrote, or speech that he gave, or scientific experiments that he wrote up, as well as all letters that people wrote to him. You can type in somebody's name or some topic, and voila, there is, the original and copies you can download of all these things that he wrote. It's an amazing resource. So I encourage people to look up Yale University Benjamin Franklin papers, because it's if your audience is as engaged as their questions are obviously showing, some of them might find that to be fun. And I have to admit, in writing on this biography, each morning I would have to go to this online catalog because I was looking up, his papers. And there are so many examples of just where he has this joyous curiosity and just this sense of humor. I found myself smiling, if not downright chuckling often, just by his trickster's sense of fun, and also his polymath ways of just, looking at the world in different ways from all the rest of the other contemporaries. Well,
Getting a little bit of additional information, as for your next book, Dick. Founders Online is the National Archives.
Okay.
Where they have placed, what they have in their extensive archives from the founders. So if you decide you want to, pursue somebody else, or see what's going on.
Jane Campbell, are you giving me more work to do?
Always. I mean, it's my turn to give it to you, as opposed to when you were giving it to me back in the day. So, of course, now here, people are still stuck on this Gulf Stream. So did Franklin figure out, is it slower to go from America to Europe or Europe to America? Because does the Gulf Stream change, which way you're going?
It depends upon, yes, which way you're going and how high up north or south within the Atlantic Ocean you are. If you're trying to get from the Americas over to England, you would go up the Atlantic coast and then across the North Atlantic Ocean, and catching the current as it moves on its way there. If you make the mistake of trying to come back the other way and you go in that same route, you're going to be facing this river that's sort of pushing you back. So the suggestion is you take different routes, either going there or coming back.
And did the shipping industry change their routes as a result of this?
American shippers did. The British shippers were very reluctant because at the time that Franklin did this, they were getting pretty ticked off at these American rebels, of Franklin, of whom was one of the key ones. And so they were somewhat dismissive to think, oh, what do Americans know to teach us about, how to run a navy? So there was some skepticism, but enough did that they realized that there was logic to this and actual real benefit of saving time and money by speeding across the Atlantic.
I love it. I love it. Now, what of all this research that you did, what was the most surprising thing that you found was sort of, boy, I didn't know that.
Well, I guess as I mentioned in passing, his sense of just joyfulness in his polymath interests. I mean, you read his notes and it said, as when he did experiments, he said it was amazing to discover, or, it revealed something was totally unexpected. And he says, I've never had so much fun in all my life. And even when experiments didn't, perform as he thought that they would, he came to this attitude of, oh, well, they showed us something new and interesting. It could lead to new engagement. So I think the thing that surprised me, I always sort of knew he had this, sly smile about him, and, this, sort of trickster sense of fun engaging. But as you read, his notes, that really just comes through, that science to him was a joy, to be able to, reveal nature's secrets. But not only nature's secrets, but he felt that government was, also this series of experiments, and he could find joy in figuring out the best ways to deal with the various issues that governments have to engage in. So joyfulness, I suppose, was the thing that surprised me, just as to how much of it there was in this, polymath of a scientist.
Well, and one of the things that it interests me in particular is that he seemed to, in his scientific inquiries, be perfectly willing to admit that didn't work. That was a try, that didn't work.
Yeah.
And that he then translated that into his work in political world.
Very
And
true.
there seems to be quite a bit of lack of ability to, sort of say, well, we tried something, it didn't work, so we're going to try something new. That ability to sort of admit that what was planned didn't happen, the ability to admit a mistake was something that gave him a lot of power.
I think that's a great observation. He, I think, defined what a good scientist, and to be honest, what a good, government official should be. Someone willing to, admit what you don't know, admit when you make mistakes, admit that things didn't work out quite the way that you wanted, and be open to the ideas of other people who might have a better notion or angle on a subject than you had. So the joyousness, I think, comes through in his ability to say, all right, let's try a different angle here. And there, as you noted in the introduction, I worked a little while on Capitol Hill. Admitting some mistakes is not always the prime characteristic of elected officials, but Franklin, I think, gave us an example of the power that it does, provide, by being willing to be open to new ideas and to acknowledge when your ideas just didn't work out.
Well, and in following along those lines, getting the rest of the story about this Founders Online.
Oh, good.
Getting more information. It actually, the American Philosophical Society developed this as a grantee from the National Historic Publications and Records Commission, which is at the archives. So Founders Online includes records from all over, not simply the archives records.
Okay.
So it is a resource that I think we maybe have to figure out with our listener who's watching all this, how we can share that story more broadly with our folks, because it is an amazing resource.
It sounds like an amazing resource, and yes, I think having more knowledge. But I was aware of resources, from the archives. I must admit, my mistake for not recognizing the name of it. But that and what the American Philosophical Society and Yale University have done, are tributes to scholars who do what is difficult work to catalog all of these letters and papers and provide them in a way that researchers can have access to. Can I just throw something in? One other observation that surprised me is also on this sort of joyfulness approach. He would often, speak in different voices because if he wanted to convey, new ideas, it was not unusual at the time that people would write anonymous letters or anonymous, little articles, to make his point. When he was 15 years old, and his brother was running a newspaper in Boston, he came up with a series, I think, of about 18 or so letters that were written from a middle-aged widow who was quite opinionated, named Silence Dogood. And Silence was she's a middle-aged widow. He's a 15-year-old teenage boy, and yet he has her convey his observations about the sort of silliness of the Bostonian elites, particularly making fun of Harvard graduates, suggesting that even after 4 years and all this expense, all they get is learning how to better dance. But also on key issues, for instance, the issue of slavery. I mean, I think we all have to acknowledge the multiplicities of the founders, including Franklin. He had slaves throughout his life. But he also came in the later years of his life to be quite, opposed to and vocal about his opposition to slavery and the slave trade. But he did it with his anonymous snark. So a Georgia legislator went during the Constitutional Convention, argued that the Bible supported slavery and that it was necessary for the economy to have people be enslaved and pick cotton and tobacco. So instead of going right towards the argument, Benjamin Franklin, creates this other character, legislator from Algiers, who says that, no, actually, it's the Quran that says enslavement is okay, and we need to enslave European Christians so that they would tend to our crops here in the hot desert of northern Africa. It was just, it's just this sly sort of, take that, you Georgia legislator. So that, it's a serious topic, but he was able to frame it in a way that I think was more effective as a result of being able to use other voices to make his points.
And so did that Algerian legislator story get picked up much?
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, it did. It obviously didn't change, the South's view towards slavery for, quite a long period of time. But it was, a lot of people referenced it, but slavery was an extremely complex issue, as you well know, and I guess, to be quite honest, it continues to be one in its aftermath. So
toward the end of his life, did he free the enslaved people that he had?
He did. In his will, he did, yes. And he actually formed an association. I think he was the president of the Pennsylvania chapter for, I'm going to get the name wrong, for the abolition of slavery. I mean, so he became much more adamant about it. I mean, to be honest, though, during the Constitutional Convention, he did not raise the issue because in his mind, it was a higher priority to keep the colonies together as a union, as a United States. And he knew that advancing an anti-slavery plank or an anti-slave trade plank would, have the Southern delegates sort of shed off and lose his opportunity to have this union. So, he picked his fights, and people can argue as to whether he picked them appropriately or not, but he didn't bring it up during the Constitutional Convention, but did subsequently with proposals and this Algerian, supposed Algerian lawmaker.
And so, obviously, first and foremost, you think we should encourage everyone to get the book and read it.
Oh, okay.
But what, and we will give everybody the information about the book. And I have the, there's always a little show and tell. Now, the question is, I don't know how to do this when I have the background in here. Oh, we'll have to show you the picture because I can't figure out how to do it. But the good news is we will send people that information. But what would our folks who listen here, they really do care deeply about the Capitol, about the history of this country, about the state of our nation, about civic understanding. If you were going to say, what is the sort of central thing that we should learn from Benjamin Franklin's long and complicated life as we move into today's world?
I go back and just focus on his relevance, particularly from a scientific perspective, his commitment to reason, his commitment to truth, to facts, his willingness to admit when he was wrong, and his willingness to, consider ideas of others. I think that civility, that tolerance, but it all sort of comes around, and I thought because other biographers had really, in my view, had sort of ignored Benjamin Franklin's science, I thought science was a new angle, not totally new, but a fresh angle on this unique and complicated but important man. And I think his relevance today is by raising up during a time where too many are dismissing science or the scientific approach of basically observing and experimenting and testing and telling the truth about what you discovered. Those are values that I think we need not only in science to ensure that we're not, doing wacky things, but also in government as we, consider, how to create a more perfect union.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about, and you've given us an entertaining hour. We appreciate that very much. It's great to see you, even if it's only in 2 dimensions. I look
forward. Again, thank you, and I appreciate the invitation. Much appreciated.
Look forward to the time when we can get together again in 3 dimensions if you're back in town. But we want to remind our folks as we close out the hour that we have several upcoming activities that are in this ongoing series. We're going to be talking about Peter Rodino, the unexpected hero of Watergate. That is coming up next week. And then we're going to do a special in-person and, hybrid in-person and live about the life of Jane Pratt, North Carolina's first congresswoman, with her biographer, Marion Deercat. And this woman has been brought to our attention by Senator Tillis and Congresswoman Virginia Foxx. So we're excited to kick off Women's History Month with that conversation. And then we're going to be looking at the lost history of the Potomac marble, a little bit of the understanding the art and architecture of the Capitol. And then we're going to take a look at lessons from the Gilded Age, what can be applied today, coming up in March. So it is a rich and full set of webinars coming forward. As always, these webinars are recorded. They're available on our YouTube site for later viewing. And, we always have to begin and end with what we call the NPR moment, reminding you that the United States Capitol Historical Society, chartered by Congress to tell the story of the Capitol and the people who work in it, but funded by our members by philanthropic gifts. And so for those of you who contribute already, thank you. For those of you who haven't contributed yet, please do. And please share the opportunity to participate with your friends, colleagues, and anyone who you think really believes that we ought to move forward with a stronger understanding of the values of this country and how those have been developed over time and how we might apply them to our work today as we try to indeed, as so many have said and Dick just referenced, form a more perfect union. Thank you, Dick Munson, for being with us. We are grateful for your time and your talent. And I hope everyone enjoys the book as much as I did. Have a good day. See you soon. Goodbye.